So welcome everybody to this next installment of our lecture series, The World in 2050, delivered all by UNESCO Chairs. And today it is a particularly great honor to have Ted Fuller, the legend, if I may say so. And Ted, I was so happy you were instrumental in establishing not only my UNESCO chair, our chair here in Bolzano, but you did so much for all other chairs. You have been so important to get the UNESCO chair idea really into practice. So we really, truly thank you for what you did. And we welcome you with a very interesting lecture on responsible futures. Ted Fuller is the UNESCO Chair on Responsible Foresight for Sustainable Development at the University of Lincoln in the United Kingdom. He has carried out research in the areas of foresight, anticipation, and emergence as part of Lincoln University International Business School since 2015. At the University of Durham Business School, he established 2 research centers, one in knowledge systems and another in foresight research. He has also been the head of the business school, faculty director of research, and chair of College of Social Science. In the meantime, Ted focuses mainly on his role as a chair and in the UNESCO network. And his specialization has been for quite a long time futures literacy, where he has made fundamental contributions, not least as one of the editors-in-chief of the famous and leading journal Futures with Elsevier. Today, Ted is going to talk about the possibility of responsible futures. And Ted, I welcome you. The stage is all yours.
Good. Thank you very much, Roland. Thank you very much for those kind words. I think Riel Miller probably had more to do with the UNESCO chairs than I did, but still, that's very kind of you. Yes, I look forward to sharing some of my work in progress with all of you. It's lovely to see you here, wherever here is. For me, it's in a small market town on the east side of the United Kingdom called Downham Market, where my world headquarters are these days, although of course I still work for the University of Lincoln. Anyway, without more to do, I shall share my screen and we'll get started. This one, I think this would be the best one to share. It has your name on it. There we go. And I'll move this over here. Excellent. All right. I'm not following the chat at the moment, so somebody can help me out with that if something is going wrong. Okay. On the possibility of responsible futures. So here's Lincoln, where I'm not today. It's somewhere between Cambridge and York in the United Kingdom, very old city with an old cathedral. Modern university, as you can see, very ambitious university, and I've been there since 2008. So this presentation will look to these particular areas. First of all, I'll say a little something about the UNESCO chair, then talk about anticipation as cause, something on the ethics of anticipatory systems, and then a section on how we might move towards the idea of responsible futures with an epilogue, if there's time. So the chair at Lincoln, our aim is really to increase the capacity of institutions, communities, individuals to frame the future and act on sustainable futures. Because sustainability means it depends on our capacity as individuals and groups and nations to act, to protect and transform society. No small question. The projects we're involved in Lincoln are sustainable development goal related through north-south collaborations with colleagues in universities around the world, trying to frame each project through a forward view, using various ways to think about the future as part of, but not the essence of, these projects, to try to stimulate transformative practices. Well, it's a small contribution we make. Here are some of the folks engaged with the chair. Time doesn't permit me to go through each one of their projects, but we do have a website which signaled at the bottom of the screen all the way through the presentation. It's clever what you can do with PowerPoint. So these people are mainly responsible for those partnerships and the projects in the partnerships. And I kind of watch them and add a few words here and there. And some of the research questions that I'm interested in all of this is, in what ways is anticipation causal? And how is responsibility manifest in anticipatory structures? You know, the chair is on responsible foresight. So let's see if we can understand that. So that's my main mission, to kind of extract and engage with the projects that we're involved in. So anticipation as cause, how's that? I'm assuming that most of the people who are attending this have some understanding of anticipatory systems. We've had a few lectures now. I don't know quite how well that's been covered. Basic theory of an anticipatory system is a natural system that contains an internal predictive model of itself and its environment, which allows it to change state at an instant, according to Robert Rosens, in accordance with the model's prediction pertaining to a later instant. So that's the theory of anticipatory system, which Rosens says is a way of defining life itself. Living things anticipate and non-living things don't. A tree has an anticipatory system, it's argued. A deciduous tree, let's say, a kind of set of chemical reactions relating photosynthesis, day length, temperature, deciding when to start dropping leaves. It's quite complex, but Rosens would argue there's an anticipatory system going on in that process. So if we assume that anticipation is existential, that all things, living things, anticipate, and I'd argue anticipation is causal. One can't really do a long presentation about anticipation without getting the kitten in somewhere. So there it is. It's curiously, the kitten really isn't, its anticipatory system isn't about guessing where the fingers are going to pop up, although they do like playing, but it's more like something that moves. It might be worth eating. And that's, I think, what the anticipatory process is going on there. So perhaps more specifically than saying anticipation is causal, our disposition to act on anticipation is what Roy Basker might call a causal mechanism. It may or may not work. It may not be triggered and fired the same in different circumstances, but it's a disposition that we have. So anticipation as a process mediates between knowledge and action. You know, here's Rosens' model of an anticipatory system. Here's the whole system. It has a model of itself in its environment. It has effectors to be able to make changes according to what that model is telling the overall system about the difference between where the system wants to be and where the system is, kind of thing. Simplified mechanism. You have absurd notions. If you have two chess players, each of which has a crystal ball that can predict the future, then how does that work? It leads to some quite complicated maths. So I think there are limitations to how we instantiate this idea of a model, and certainly some people working on anticipation say there's no model. It's more conceptual than that. But I find it useful as a way of framing and theorizing our relationship with the future. And I think there's more work to be done yet on that theorization. So if we see that anticipatory systems involve inference and action via these effectors. So, you're anticipating something, it's not going the way you want it to do, it's not desirable, so you act to change, to create instability effectively. Or it's going really, really well and it's heading towards your desired futures, you act to hold it there. Or you're threatened by something, so you act to hold the status quo. So you have this idea of looking ahead, deciding whether or not you should take action according to what your desires are. And that's a mediation between knowledge and action, and hence the causal power of that anticipation. Here's the way that Rosens put it: it's a natural system. There's a kind of process of encoding what's going on in the natural system to create some kind of formal system within the agent, the anticipatory system. And there's an inference process, a kind of set of judgments about how that works and what's going on. And then that inference is decoded into some form of action back into the natural system. That's the way Rosens described it. So we have entailment here, kind of actual entailment, but within the individual system, the person, the agent, whatever it is, the tree, there's some inferences being made about the possibility of the future changing, and therefore the need to act. And turning away from the systems theory towards psychology, positive psychology, and a really interesting set of work from Martin Seligman and Peter Railton and others. And Homo Prospectus was the book that they published a few years ago. Prospections natural. Representation of possible futures is, they argue, a ubiquitous feature of the human mind. Involves no backward causation. It's guidance not by the future itself, but by the present evaluative representations of possible future states. So these are people who've, as far as I know, never been to a futures literacy course. They come from it from a very different perspective, a positive psychology perspective. And the fields haven't really connected, to be perfectly honest, but it's this interesting work we should take notice of at the very least. Central organizing feature of perception, cognition, affect, memory, motivation, and action. They would argue prospections, a central organizing feature for the way our minds work. Navigating into the future is seen as a core organizing principle of animal and human behavior. It's Martin Seligman here, that's Peter Railton side here. So there's arguments from that perspective that we might also take account of. There is a bibliography at the end of when you have the slides. There's a slide with a bibliography on. Okay, now I want to connect that to something called dispositional anticipation. I think that might be something I made up, but if Rosens, Gilbert, Seligman, and others assert anticipation or prospectus existential, that it's a characteristic of life itself, as Rosens would say, then anticipation can be described as a disposition. Perhaps more specifically, prospection and acting upon anticipations is dispositional, as I said a couple of slides earlier, something similar to that. And this idea of dispositional anticipations, I call it, comes from the work of Roy Basker, philosopher, a critical realist philosopher, who argues very much about, well, different modes. Let's just say about dispositions. Entities have a disposition, causal powers that are transcendental from one particular actual world context, real world context in which they are observed as being situated. So, a glass will shatter if dropped on hard ground, wherever the context, wherever in the world it happens to be, whatever else is going around. So that kind of causal power of shattering is a transcendental for. Of course. So, and moral realism, Jack Basker would argue, is epistemically consistent with alternative futures, a world of possibilities. The things don't have to be as they are now. Things have causal powers to change that and be transcend from one situation to another. So where other possibilities exist from what exists now, and this world could be different. So modal realism, as Basker called it, is indispensable for concrete utopianism and for human freedom, our ability to change. Otherwise, we'd be stuck in the same worlds. So I make connections to that because I think it's an interesting area and supports the ideas. And we turn to responsibility now. Why is it that I was asked, why is it that people find Foresight so attractive in this particular era? And the way I described it last week was, well, we're in the age of the unprecedented. Now, I say that, the unprecedented, because every time a piece of shocking news happens, whether it's on the political sphere or the climate sphere in particular, well, it's unprecedented. This is unprecedented. Well, unprecedented. So I think we're in the age of the unprecedented. I've heard that word used more than just about anything else. And unprecedented means not the same as the past. And therefore, if things aren't the same as the past, risk isn't measurable. It becomes Knightian uncertainty. And so I was talking to someone from the OECD last week. He said, once something becomes Knightian, we economists step back from it. We can't do Knightian. There's no data. So strategic foresight is a means of exploring futures as if they will not be the same as the past, to prepare for novelty and to guide actions that have effect on the future, to guide actions. So if we want to guide actions, how do we guide actions for good? So our actions have influence on our future and that of others. We're entangled in relationships that shape our futures, that co-create futures. To what extent should we be responsible for those futures we co-create? Considering the future is an act of responsibility. That in itself, when you start to think about the future, kind of implies some responsible action going on. And the question then is a responsibility to act on the results of exploratory foresight an ethical consequence of that exploration? If you explore, is an ethical consequence that you have some responsibility to act on what you find? Certainly that's what Gaston Berger would say. So the consequences of anticipatory processes may affect others in desirable or undesirable ways, and therefore the practices of futurists, it's kind of responsible foresight, the practices of futurists involve ethics. And responsibility is therefore inherent in such processes, though may not be explicit, and often aren't explicit. And I think that's an issue. If we're going to do good foresight and foresight for good, we need to be explicit about responsibility and the ethics involved. So the ethics inherent in anticipatory systems is in this inferential, this forming of inferences. I think that's where it seems to me to be inherent. Anticipatory systems involve judgment. We're making anticipatory judgments of future value. Is this something we want? Is this something we don't want? How should we act? Robert Rosen himself said the character of a predictive model assumes almost an ethical character, even in a purely abstract context. And again, I make this point, anticipation is a process mediates between knowledge and action and has causal power. So here's my argument for why ethics is inherent in anticipation, where it's inherent in anticipation, in the way we make judgments about how to act. And going back to the positive psychologists again, Martin Seligman and so on, Peter Elton, what if morality is not the evaluation of present action, but the prediction of character and its thrust into the future? Morality is an evaluation of character and its thrust into the future. Morality and social norms, as well as laws and technologies, add structure to the future, making otherwise unavailable actions and outcomes possible, says Peter Elton in Homer Prospectus as the introduction. To want to take an action because we like the idea of that, what that action might yield, even if it's remote in time or novel in character. So again, this was playing into the argument that foresight, anticipation has ethical character. And here's another perspective on that, the kind of notion of morality within psychological processes, positive psychology. Acting on moral judgment is the affective system, our human emotion. Our values serve to orientate and move us. The affective system involves attention, perception, memory, inference, action readiness in a coordinated way. I think you see how the argument's taking shape here. So towards responsible futures then, how do we put all this into some kind of practice and context of our work? Well, if you've been studying future studies and anticipation and so on for a while now, you'll know that future studies is very much about a kind of sense of knowledge about the future in some way or another, however conditional. And we're concerned about the security of that in making claims about the future, scenarios, images, trends, environmental scanning, environmental analysis, risk analysis, all this kind of stuff that happens in strategic foresight, for example. And there's things we can know and there's what we can't know. And I think that's part of the job of doing strategic foresight. But we have this issue about also our relationship with the future as well. And the security, not just of our knowledge, but of our ethics, our issues of governance, consequences, freedom, agency, identity, the values in practice, the hopes and fears, the imagination, as Apatarai puts it, imagination, aspiration, anticipation, future as cultural fact. So what are our responsibility and what are the anticipatory effects, a bit like the two crystal balls in the chess game of this? So I think this should be part of our thinking as futurists. So it was in 2019, I been thinking about this for quite some time actually, but my inaugural lecture as head of business school at Lincoln was all about responsible futures and how a business school needed to be like that. So it's taken a while to get even to here, but still. What's a responsible foresight framework might look like? In 2019, I thought about, well, we need relevant context for facilitating change. We should be doing our work in places in relation to contexts like sustainable development, for example, that appears to be better for humanity. That we should be attendant to the responsibility for what plausible consequences might arise from our work. We should be inclusive with our stakeholders, people concerned with and related, for whom the future we're working on has effect, at the very least. To explore beyond anticipation, to explore in different avenues, to expand the frame of anticipation, and to have effective anticipatory systems. And these, I thought, well, these are probably things we need to think about. And in terms of anticipatory systems, then explicit ethics within the system, having trying to achieve relatively isomorphic modeling relations, that is to say, as Rosens called it, modeling relation, the relation between the inferential model in an anticipatory system and the natural system, and how close these are related. Trying to maintain the closeness of these, is a major challenge. But we do that through the way we critical frame, sort of a critical framing of how we see the world, the various use of metaphors and so on. Anticipatory assumptions, as Rio Miller would call it, layered analysis, as Sahel might call it, systematic comprehension, being able to understand the whole system. How is that stored, for example, and sensitivity to the dynamics in the system that we're concerned with, how we act, when we should act, when we shouldn't act, how sensitive are we to changes. All of these things are kind of related to the closeness between the model we have, if that's the way you want to put it, and the real world that we're concerned with. And also the effectors that might produce change should have some kind of ethical dimension to those. So again, this is all work in progress. This is 2019. That's kind of thinking about it. So we established a Responsible Futures program with Fabrice Riblet, who has the UNESCO Chair in Poitiers in France. We ran a workshop at UNESCO in December 2019 and began to get this discussion going. So it's a joint project, the Responsible Futures program. Fabrice and myself, with Anne Marché-Rublat and Narcisse Héraclide and April. Well, Narcisse and April are both working in the field of responsibility in different ways, and both Narcisse has now just about completed his PhD. April's a PhD student, and that this program is developing well. We've engaged with a network of futurists, including several UNESCO chairs. We've run 10 workshops so far. Run a workshop every couple of months or so. It's a one book project, which is well underway, and there needs to be more. But that's where we are right now. And the purpose of that Responsible Futures program is to better understand ways in which responsibilities manifest in the processes of anticipation and foresight as future-making activities, trying to improve the body of knowledge that informs and supports practices of responsible future making. There are precedents, of course, to any notion of work on responsible futures, and just a handful listed here, but there are many, many, many more. By no means have I discovered them all yet. Gaston Berger, in his kind of thesis of the responsibility to act, Richard Slaughter's work on professionalization of the futures studies of foresight activities. He's done much work in that. Wendell Bell, I feature his book here as a kind of little icon because Wendell Bell wrote Foundations of Future Studies, 2-volume book. One volume was all about kind of methods and who was doing what and where they were doing it and so on. And the other half of the volume was about values, objectivity, and a good society. So it's very much connecting futures work with creation of a good future and good society and values. We should all read it, simply. And then more recently, there have been articles like Bruce Ton, for example, on future generations and institutions for future generations. but his work is one of many on that field. Patrick van der Duin, looking at how, I think, foresight, again, returning to the idea of professional foresight, ethical, responsible foresight. And Simone and Esther and Johan and Josephine were guest editors for a special issue on the world in 2050 and the question of responsible futures in 2050. So there are many precedents to this work, which we're still learning from. How is responsibility manifest in anticipation as future making? How do processes of anticipation link to being responsible? How can implicit notions of responsibility be made more explicit in future-oriented planning and preparation? I think this is important, particularly. How do we make it more explicit? Well, we need to know what we're trying to find before we can make it explicit. How do novel formations of responsibility emerge? How can these be better recognized in normative processes? So it's very kind of critical and analytical, as well as having affect. And the book one that we're doing is we're operationalizing some of these questions through case studies, anticipatory situations, supported by conceptual frameworks to kind of create a tentative framework for responsible foresight, responsible practice, responsible futures, if you will, how we might synthesize that. Trying to articulate the conceptual base for the study of responsibility in the process of foresight and anticipation, try to identify examples of future making, in practice to use situations where practices of responsibility can be revealed. Can we ground the identification of responsibility in futures practice through cases? That remains to be seen, actually. We're doing that work now. And we can kind of critique and develop that through open peer review. So there's much work to be done. Much work to be done towards the question of, is it possible to articulate principles for responsible futures? Are we able to articulate that? Not at the moment, I would say. It's something we should work towards. A principle is taken to mean a moral rule, a proposition, a belief that provides a foundation for deciding conduct, what to do, principle. And a principle might well be within our work to evaluate the ethics of a future-related action on its consequences. That might be a principle. I think these things are to be developed and discussed and critiqued, and all the things that you do in academic work to kind of form them. We have thought about this, obviously, to some extent, and tried to categorize some of the reasons or some of the areas where we might need to think about the ethics of what we're doing. So if we just take the whole idea of emergence and becoming, that the future emerges from the present in unpredictable ways, we are always, as Deleuze would say, always becoming, never being, but always becoming, then how do we think about guiding the dynamics of change while keeping the future, keeping open the future? That's about values, morals, ethics, change over time. Sorry, that's a typo there in the presentation, but values, morals, ethics, change over time. The kind of, there's futures of, there's that axiology changes. It's a dynamic thing, as John Danaher argued recently. So if the values of people in 50 years' time or 100 years' time are going to be different from ours, how can we make judgments about the long term and what's best for them when their values are different from ours? It's a dilemma. So we have to have some principles, I think, with regard to that. In any kind of, secondly, in any kind of consideration of a future or the future is always bounded. It might be bounded ontologically. What and who is included? What are we talking about? Are we talking about industry? Are we talking about humanity? Are we talking about country? Are we talking political formations? And then epistemically, there are boundaries. What knowledge is used in order to make evaluations, and axiologically, what's valuable? Each of these are bounded, culturally bounded, perhaps geographically bounded, socially bounded, conceptually bounded. So how do we articulate the boundaries, the limitations, if you will? And then within any context, there are tensions and biases and conflicts, for sure. Future's a contested space. Principles are needed for responsible approaches, this involvement of stakeholders, whose voices get to be heard. How do you actually manage the tensions caused by, on the one hand, let's say, economic development of impoverished nations who want to encourage more tourism, for example, to gather income or become more technologically capable, competent, while at the same time that's giving rise to more climate changing activity, more flying for tourism and so on. And, somebody's going to lose out in this. So how is that managed? And how do we manage that within our Foresight activities? And then the fourth area, for now, there are many others, but this is just a way of categorizing some of the issues, and this is the way the book is structured, is this whole sense of futures and anticipation is very much, from a Western point of view, concerned with agency and freedom. Our freedom to keep the future open, our freedom to act, our emancipation is based on our own ability to change, as Basker would have it. And so the freedom of agency comes with an implication of responsibility. But at the same time, it can become therapy. It can become over-promising. Well, of course, you can do anything. Well, you can't do anything, at least not yet. So what extent, if we're developing futures literacy, what extent should futures literacy temper expectations of what's possible? And to what extent should it assert the nature of responsibility? To me, these are still very much open questions. Maybe even the wrong questions, but they're questions for now that we're working on. So let me summarize that for now, and allow you to ask some questions, and then maybe go to an epilogue later. Anticipation is existential. This is kind of assumptions or the summary of what points I've made. A disposition to act on anticipation is a causal mechanism. Inferential anticipatory judgments have ethical consequences. So morality and responsibility are somehow inherent in futures practices, whether it's about thinking about the future, modeling the future, being entrepreneurial and creating something new for the future, being an activist and trying to prevent things from happening in the future. These are inherent and sometimes explicit, but often not explicit. Future studies relates overall to humanity's relationships with its futures. So, question now, what explicit principles might be valuable in revealing and assessing future studies and foresight practices from an ethical perspective? So far, this is what I've said. There's certainly work to be done on this question through what might be called collective intelligence, our gathering together, our critiquing, our exchanging, our viewpoints. I think this is much to be done, but much to learn from good work historically. So I'll leave you for now with a closing question. And then we'll see where we take it from here. How would you defend the challenge that your foresight processes were irresponsible? Somebody said, I think your foresight processes are irresponsible. How would you be able to defend yourself against that challenge? Or perhaps more subtly, that the consequences of your actions go far beyond what you believe you are responsible for. So how would you defend that? Okay, I think we'll pause at this stage and allow some questions. And I'll stop sharing just for now.
Yeah, thank you so much, dear Ted, for this super inspiring presentation in the spirit, as I perceive it, of humanism and enlightenment. We have lots of material to ponder. You said anticipation is existential, which would imply that if we explore our mechanisms of anticipation, we at the same time research our existence. And vice versa, once we go a little bit deeper into our conditio humana, we are already in the realm of anticipation, at least to some extent. I think this is an extremely interesting interrelation to further explore, certainly also by philosophical means. And now that we are taking questions from the public, please write in the chat function. Now that we are taking questions, I would like to start the attempt with maybe a too existential question. I found it particularly inspiring when you said, well, the future is always about freedom. We need the future to be free. The future is part of being free. And so any agency that is dedicated towards the future, be it conscious or subconscious, has to do to some extent with enlarging, broadening our spaces of freedom. I believe firmly that this is the case, but there is a catch in all this, in my view. If the future is always about getting more freedom, in essence, or exploring various ways of being free, why is it then, and I'm a political scientist, that we have so many foresight processes, so many approaches towards potential futures in the world by authoritarian powers, by warmongers, by populists, that in essence try to make us less free and not freer? So is there not a contradiction inbuilt in the whole issue of future that is connected with freedom, if so many futures, and I could name at least half a dozen one, in the world are really about restricting our freedoms or even curbing them down? So this would be my first question, and I know this is perhaps too big a question to be answered in a few minutes time. The second question is about ethics. It is, as in essential, the same question. If there is ethics involved in looking towards the future, or at least being occupied to some extent with potential futures, personally, collectively, how comes that we have less ethical reasoning nowadays in the public sphere than perhaps still in the 90s? Just a buzzword, the social media, which are valves of letting steam off, the advertising industry, all kinds of discourses which are really not ethical, dominating the public sphere. Does that mean that there is a lack of futures in the public discourse nowadays?
Right.
These are my two questions.
Just small questions.
Just small ones, yeah.
Well, I have a simple answer to both questions, which is probably all I can do because they're very wide ranging. But the simple answer, I guess, is about power and the maintenance of power, and also the role of future studies, which some would say their work is to tell truth to power. But future studies is a very political activity. And my point is that those futurists who talk about morals and ethics and the better future and so on are very concerned with exactly the points that you make. So they see their work as anti the closure of futures. They see their work as progressive, and that is absolutely a particular value within the field. And yes, and there's a question of, well, one needs to make that explicit in one's work, I think. But the future is a contested space, and people who are attracted to future studies do so often because they want to change the world for the better. All the connection with sustainable development, all of that is fundamentally about power, about the holding of power, about the closing of futures as a way of holding on to power, about how people are very comfortable with the status quo. Often they don't like change necessarily. It's a threat as well as a promise. The way that futures are narrated, the way they're framed, all of these things are hugely open to political influence of the powerful. And so, where I put us as a community, if one can do that at all, is as struggling against power, as trying to empower people to be able to think more widely, not to be trapped by the frames that we're presented with. And this is a major challenge, the challenge, to my view, of our whole field.
Yeah, I would even say that this is the main challenge of futures literacy, because making people more futures literate means empowering them.
Yes, absolutely.
Just that I don't see enough effort in this direction.
Yeah.
I, on the contrary, just to conclude my remarks, see that people are a little bit exhausted of participatory processes. They don't see that their participation is reaching out to truly changing something.
Right.
They participate but don't see the point in it. So to some extent, futures literacy relies also on a functioning democracy. I don't know how you perceive it, but the times we are in are not really the best times of democracy I saw in my life. And we can only hope that democracy is recovering from some shocks we experienced lately, by systemic crisis, by wars, by populism, in order then to strengthen the participatory agency towards potential futures. Because the less democracy you have, probably the less future you have.
Yeah. I think that's right. I mean, the notion of anticipatory system has effectors, has the ability to change, has agency. without which it isn't an anticipatory system. So just from that point of view, it's I've always linked, because of my work, I've always linked futures, what you would call futures literacy, to entrepreneurship. Okay, it comes at it from a very different angle and has a very different language, but it's both are concerned with. And Richard Slaughter wrote about this many years ago. Obviously, he didn't call it futures literacy then; he called it future studies. But it's all about empowering, encouraging, enabling people to see alternative futures, and to give them a sense of hope for that. You use the very word. One can hope for a greater democracy. Will the population of the world see through and be able to see through its futures being foreclosed, or will they be comfortable that, like I said, we can't know what people's values will be in the future. We can only be based on the values we have today. So yeah, I don't have answers to that question. I agree that this is what our work's about.
Yeah. So I once again, to finish, encourage last questions. If there are none of them, I would say that we conclude the session. Let me say that we both work to some extent for the most powerless organization in the world, which is UNESCO. UNESCO has only the power of ideas.
Yes.
But not so much money. It has no army. It has not the kind of pressure options that other institutions have. But I think the biggest advantage of UNESCO and of a chair system is really that we deal with the ideas that lead us towards the future. And this can truly be a liberatory aspect in the framework of our time. Now, there is a comment to conclude by Letizia.
I can see that.
Yeah. And I read it. The number of democracies has declined over the last 2 decades. How can we change this concerning trend by using anticipatory governance? And let me add, thank you very much, Letizia. That is a hugely important question. Let me add, maybe to refine the question a little bit from my side. There is a new approach by the OECD, but also by UNESCO, the so-called approach of anticipatory innovation governance. Is this to some extent related to a timely future work that really responds to Letizia's question? How can we change the concerning trend that democracies decline by using anticipatory governance?
Yeah. I was wondering, read the question, wondering whether I could connect the first half with the second half. In other words, and anticipatory governance, I suppose, is very much about precautionary approaches. One could, I suppose, look at the consequences of and try to articulate the consequences of decreasing levels of democracy, greater centralization, and so on. In a way, the process of elaborating, backcasting those consequences over a timeline might be an interesting form of anticipatory governance to bring to that challenge. I mean, anticipatory governance is about, here is something we don't understand. Here's something that's emergent. Here's something that, because it's moving quite quickly and because it has a lot of power, artificial intelligence being a good example, we don't quite know how things are going to work out. So let's let's try to stop the worst possible things from happening, or let's try to stay on board with it, or let's monitor it in real time, or this kind of anticipatory governance. So presumably one can do the same with democracies. The question is, and part of the explanation for the rise in centralization is question of truth and belief and trust, and how one builds that factor of trust and belief into something like the field of future studies. So that in order to be of quality, one has to be trusted in this field. So those are some sort of thoughts off the top of the head, really, in terms of that question. Obviously, Lettier is keen to do so.
Great, and all this has obviously also to do with leadership. We had a conference on leadership lately where we saw that freedom and leadership are paradoxically interconnected. And this leads us back to your field, to business, to the economy, and so on.
I have something I could share, which was produced when Fabrice and I ran a workshop in UNESCO in 2019. It kicked off the project. There were, I don't know, 20 people in the room, or 25 people, something like that, for the workshop that we had. And in the form of summary, because it's quite hard summarizing what happened, but the form of summary, that we produce an ode. An ode is a kind of lyric poem, an ode. And so in the remaining time, I could share that with people. It's slightly entertaining, and maybe it's part of the anticipatory governance question as well. Shall I do that? It'll be okay. Let's see if I can get the button going. This one here. Share. Okay. Here we are. Okay. So this is called Ode to an Empty Chair, as told to me and Fabrice in the workshop. And this is below is this long list of people who were definitely there, plus a few unnamed and some empty chairs. But on with the ode in the short time available. Ode to an empty chair, an empty chair. Humanity is missing. Ethics means asking questions, such as, why is this chair empty? Such as, what kind of chair is it? Such as, who or what should be sitting there? Being explicit about values is ethical. The chair represents those who should be included, but are not. It's an empty UNESCO chair. Perhaps it is the most ethical of all UNESCO chairs. It has no a priori assertion of particular futures or values, no critique of powerful influences, no sense of context, even though context is everything. Many real-world challenges threaten the chair's non-occupants. This is real. The challenges, threats, or opportunities are not created by professional foresight. The challenges, threats, or opportunities are not created by professional foresight. They emerge through human interactions and produce real impacts on privacy from ungovernance to surveillance capitalism, hunger from greed, destruction from overconsumption, human judgment from artificial judgment, but also happiness from the possibility of fulfillment. The empty chair cannot evaluate consequences nor care for the future. How can this be most ethical? What is ethical in a world created through unintended consequences, but narrated and monitored by anticipatory governance of intended consequences? The empty chair tells a story of the hubris of humanity, hubris of rationality as authenticity. When we look at the empty chair in future, it may be humanity that is missing. So a thought for your foresight. When we look at the empty chair in future, it may be humanity that is missing. The future's in our hands. We create it. There we are. Thank you.
Thank you, dear Ted. That is food for thought indeed, and a very poetic one. Thank you so much, dear Ted, for being with us. Thank you all for being with us. Please stay with us, follow us. The next lecture of this series is going to take place on the 30th of June. And it will be delivered by Marco Villenius, the UNESCO Chair in Learning for Transformation and Planetary Futures of the University of Turku in Finland. Marco will talk about future literacy skills for this century. Very ambitious title. Thank you all for staying with us. Thank you all for returning next time. Thank you so much, Ted. See you in a bit.
Bye-bye all.
Bye-bye.
Bye.